You know the sound. Even if you've never had a child, even if you've never been in the same room as a newborn, you know the sound. A baby crying is one of the most neurologically penetrating sounds a human being can hear. It is not background noise. It is not something you can tune out. It demands attention in a way that is biological, not cultural. The human auditory system is specifically calibrated to respond to infant cries with urgency. Now, imagine that sound, not in a house with walls and neighbors and the option of closing a door, but in a small group shelter where every member of the group is within arm's reach. Where there is no separate room, no white noise machine, no pacifier from a pharmacy, no pediatrician to call, no formula to supplement feeding, no understanding of colic or teething or ear infections beyond what direct experience has taught. Just a crying baby. A parent who has already tried everything they know, and a group of people who need to sleep because tomorrow requires everything they have. What happened? The question seems almost too ordinary to be worth asking about ancient humans. And yet the answer takes us to the heart of one of the most consequential questions in human evolutionary biology. Why do human babies cry so much? Why are they so dependent for so long? And what did the social structures of early human groups actually look like in practice? Let's get into it. First, let's establish something that most people don't fully appreciate. Human infants are extraordinarily helpless compared to the newborns of almost every other primate species. A newborn chimpanzee can grip its mother's fur within hours of birth and cling without assistance. A newborn horse can stand and walk within a day. A newborn human cannot support its own head, cannot grip reliably, cannot roll over, cannot do almost anything unassisted. Human newborns are, relative to the developmental stage of their brains, born extremely early. This is not an accident. It is the result of a specific evolutionary compromise between two competing biological pressures. The human brain is extraordinarily large relative to body size, and it grows rapidly in the first years of life. But the human pelvis, shaped by the demands of bipedal locomotion, of walking upright on two legs, creates a birth canal that cannot accommodate a fully developed human brain. The compromise is to be born before the brain has finished developing. A human infant at birth has a brain that is approximately 25% of its adult size. By comparison, a chimpanzee infant is born with a brain closer to 45% of adult size. This means that human infants are dependent for longer, in more fundamental ways than any other primate. And it means that the systems they use to communicate that dependence, primarily crying, are extraordinarily important. A helpless infant that cannot signal its needs is an infant that will not survive. Natural selection has therefore shaped human infant crying to be as effective as possible at mobilizing adult attention and caregiving. The biology of infant crying is genuinely remarkable. Researcher Kathleen Wermke at the University of Würzburg has spent decades analyzing the acoustic structure of newborn cries and found that they are not random vocalizations. They have complex melodic structure, consistent patterns across cultures, and specific acoustic features, particularly in the frequency range between 300 and 600 hertzes that are uniquely effective at activating the adult human stress response. The cry of a human infant activates the amygdala, the brain's threat and emotion processing center in adults who hear it, even adults who have never had children, even adults who are actively trying to ignore it. Brain imaging research consistently shows that the response to infant cries is immediate, bilateral, and involves the same neural circuits activated by other urgent threats. This is not a learned response. It is a biological response that evolution has built into the adult human brain. And the cry is calibrated. High-pitched, urgent cries, cries associated with pain or acute distress, produce stronger responses than lower-pitched, rhythmic cries associated with hunger. The adult brain is, in effect, reading the cry for information about urgency and responding accordingly. The infant is communicating, and the adult is receiving, through a channel that bypasses conscious processing. So what did early humans actually do in response to an inconsolable infant? The first answer is physical, carrying, movement. Contact. Research across traditional cultures and developmental psychology consistently shows that the most effective interventions for infant crying are physical holding, rocking, walking, skin-to-skin contact. These are not just comfort measures. They are physiologically active. Rocking activates the vestibular system and has measurable calming effects on the nervous system. Skin-to-skin contact regulates infant body temperature, stabilizes heart rate and breathing, and releases oxytocin in both infant and caregiver. Researcher James McKenna at the University of Notre Dame, who has spent his career studying mother-infant sleep and co-sleeping practices across cultures, has documented that the physical proximity of a caregiver, particularly the rhythmic sounds of breathing and heartbeat, has profound physiological effects on infant sleep-wake cycling. Infants who sleep in close physical proximity to caregivers have more stable sleep patterns, more regulated arousal, and lower rates of prolonged crying than infants sleeping separately. In early human groups, this proximity was not a choice or a practice. It was simply the reality of the environment. Infants were carried, held, and slept in contact with their caregivers continuously. The separation that produces so much infant crying in modern contexts, cribs, separate rooms, scheduled feeding rather than nursing on demand, was not a feature of early human life. But what about the crying that persisted despite all of this? The infant who is held, fed, warm, and healthy, but still screaming? Here, the story connects directly to the social structure of early human groups. Because in those groups, the response to a persistently crying infant was not just parental, it was communal. Researcher Sarah Blaffer-Hrdy at the University of California, Davis has developed what may be the most important theory in contemporary human evolutionary anthropology. Her concept of cooperative breeding or alloparental care argues that human infants evolved to be dependent not just on their mothers, but on a network of caregivers, what she calls alloparents, including fathers, grandmothers, older siblings, and other group members. This is not just a behavioral flexibility. It is a biological coevolution between infant characteristics and group caregiving capacity. Human infants, unlike chimpanzee infants, actively solicit care from multiple adults. They make eye contact readily with people who are not their mother. They are calmed by a wider range of caregivers. They have extended periods of wakefulness and social engagement that are not present in other primate infants. These characteristics, Hrdy argues, evolved specifically because human infants needed to secure care from multiple group members, not just their biological mothers. This means that when an early human infant cried inconsolably, the response was not just maternal. Other adults, grandmothers, with their particularly significant contribution to alloparental care, fathers, older siblings, aunts, unrelated group members with their own investment in group cohesion would have responded, would have taken the infant, would have tried. And this distribution of caregiving responsibility reduced the burden on any single caregiver and gave the infant access to a wider range of potential comforting approaches. There is also the grandmother specifically, and the grandmother's contribution to early human infant care is one of the most remarkable findings in all of evolutionary anthropology. Researcher Kristen Hawkes at the University of Utah developed the grandmother hypothesis, the argument that the human post-reproductive lifespan, which is extraordinary among primates, evolved specifically because grandmothers provided essential caregiving support to their daughters' infants. In most primates, females remain reproductively active until near death. Human females typically cease reproduction in their late 40s or early 50s and then live for decades. From an evolutionary perspective, this requires explanation. Why would natural selection preserve decades of life after reproductive capacity ends? Hawkes' answer is that post-reproductive grandmothers were doing something so valuable for their genetic legacy, caring for grandchildren, freeing their daughters to reproduce again more quickly, providing additional care for infants who might otherwise not survive, that the post-reproductive lifespan itself became an evolutionary adaptation. Grandmothers, in other words, are not a luxury of modern human longevity. They may be one of the reasons humans live as long as we do. And grandmothers with a crying infant would have been among the most effective caregivers available. Their experience, their calm, their specific knowledge of what works accumulated across the care of their own children and potentially their own grandchildren would have made them valuable resources in exactly the moments when a parent, exhausted and frustrated, most needed help. What about the crying that came at night? The infant who disrupted group sleep. This is where the story intersects with something we discussed in another context, the nature of early human sleep. Early humans slept in groups, in close physical proximity, without the radical sleep separation that characterizes modern Western culture. An infant in this environment was never isolated. It was never more than arm's reach from multiple potential caregivers. The nighttime crying that is such a significant feature of modern parenting, the infant in a separate room, crying alone until a parent wakes and responds, was not the structure of early human nighttime life. When an infant cried at night, in a group sleep setting, multiple adults could respond simultaneously. The burden of nighttime caregiving was distributed. And the physical environment, the warmth, the sounds of other breathing bodies, the proximity to the caregiver's heartbeat provided constant regulation that reduced crying in the first place. This is not a romantic idealization of ancient life. It is an observation about how the human infant's biology was calibrated. Human infants were calibrated for an environment of continuous physical contact, group proximity, and multiple caregivers. The crying that seems so excessive and so difficult in modern isolated parenting contexts may be, in part, an expression of the mismatch between the environment infants evolved for and the environment modern infants actually live in. There is one more dimension of this story that I want to address directly. The question of what happened when nothing worked. Because in every human culture, there are infants who cry inconsolably, who are in genuine distress that caregiving cannot resolve. Infants with colic, with illness, with injuries, with developmental issues that make them chronically difficult to soothe. In the modern world, these situations are managed with medical intervention, with formula, with pacifiers, with an entire infrastructure of pediatric support. In the early human world, they were managed with the only resource available: persistence, community, and time. There is also evidence, uncomfortable to contemplate, that in some circumstances, early human groups practiced what researchers euphemistically call selective neglect. Situations in which infants who appeared unlikely to survive, or who represented too great a burden, were not provided with the level of care that would maximize their survival chances. This is documented across ethnographic records in traditional cultures operating under conditions of extreme resource scarcity. It is not a pleasant aspect of early human life, but it is part of the honest picture of what happened when the demands of infant care exceeded the resources available to meet them. Most of the time, however, the answer to an inconsolable baby was not neglect. It was the opposite: more holding, more movement, more people, more patience. More of the things that the infant's biology was asking for: contact, warmth, sound, the presence of known, trusted other humans. The village that it takes to raise a child is not a modern metaphor. It is a description of the actual social environment in which human infants evolved. And when the baby wouldn't stop crying, the village showed up. If this one made you think differently about the village around you, you know what to do. I'll see you in the next one. There's something worth examining more closely about the specific role of sound in early human infant care. Because the human infant's response to sound is extraordinary, and it tells us something important about what early human caregivers would have discovered through direct experience. Infant crying is reduced by certain categories of sound with remarkable consistency across cultures. Rhythmic sounds, the sounds of a heartbeat, the sounds of breathing, the sounds of regular movement are calming. White noise, the ambient background sound of a natural environment, is calming. The sound of the human voice, particularly at lower frequencies, is calming. And music, specifically rhythmic and melodic music, is calming across virtually every culture that has been studied. Researcher Samuel Mayer at Harvard University has documented the universality of infant-directed singing across cultures, what's known as lullabies, and found that the acoustic features of lullabies are remarkably consistent across languages and musical traditions. Slow tempo, regular rhythm, simple melodic contour, a specific pattern of pitch descent that seems to signal calm and safety. These features appear in lullabies from cultures as different as the Hadza of Tanzania and Japanese classical tradition and Native American traditions and European folk music. The lullaby, in its structural features, appears to be a human universal. This means that early human caregivers were almost certainly singing to crying infants, not because they were taught that this was effective, but because it worked and because the behavioral and acoustic features that make lullabies work are deeply embedded in both the adult repertoire and the infant auditory processing system. The first lullaby was probably not composed. It probably emerged from the simple act of a caregiver making sound any rhythmic, calm, melodic sound, and discovering that the infant responded. There is also the dimension of what early human groups believed about crying infants and what was causing the distress. Without the framework of germ theory, of developmental pediatrics, of the knowledge that teething causes pain or that ear infections are bacterial, early humans understood infant distress through whatever explanatory frameworks their culture provided. In many traditional cultures, unexplained infant crying was attributed to spiritual causes, the presence of a harmful spirit, the violation of a cultural taboo, the influence of a malevolent supernatural force, the evil eye. These explanations sound very different from the pediatric explanations we use today, but the behavioral responses they generated were often functionally identical. If an infant is crying because of a harmful spirit, you call the shaman who performs ritual, which involves rhythmic sound, smoke, physical contact, and the calming presence of multiple trusted adults gathered around the infant. The content of the explanation was culturally specific. The practice it generated more contact, more sound, more community presence was functionally similar to what developmental psychology tells us actually helps. This is not a coincidence. It reflects the accumulated empirical wisdom of generations of caregivers who discovered, through trial and error across thousands of years, what actually worked. The cultural explanations organized and transmitted the knowledge. The knowledge itself was real. And then there is the experience of the caregiver. A parent with an inconsolable infant is in one of the most psychologically and physically demanding situations a human being can face. Sleep deprivation, the biological activation of the stress response by the infant cry, the helplessness of not knowing what's wrong, the fear that something is seriously wrong, the social pressure in a group context where others are also being disturbed, all of these create conditions of significant psychological stress. In early human groups, this stress was shared. The caregiver was not alone with the crying infant in a way that modern parents often are. The group was present, available, and invested. The grandmother or the aunt who took the baby for an hour gave the primary caregiver something that is not easily available in modern isolated parenting, the break that made continued caregiving sustainable. Researcher Darcia Narvaez at the University of Notre Dame has documented the effects of what she calls evolved developmental niche, the set of caregiving practices that match the environment human infant biology evolved in on long-term developmental outcomes. The practices she identifies: continuous physical contact in infancy, breastfeeding on demand, multiple caregivers, positive social climate around the infant, responsive caregiving rather than scheduled caregiving. These are not exotic parenting philosophies. They are descriptions of the environment human infant biology was calibrated for. When a baby wouldn't stop crying in an early human group, the village didn't just help the baby, it helped the parent. It prevented the isolation and exhaustion that make the experience of inconsolable crying so devastating. It distributed the biological and psychological cost of caregiving across the community in a way that made the whole enterprise more survivable for everyone involved. That is perhaps the most important thing to understand about early human infant care. It was not a solo project. It was a community endeavor. And the community, the aunts, the grandmothers, the older siblings, the other parents who had been through it before, was what made it possible. There's one final thing I want to say before we close. About what the crying baby meant to the group, not just as a problem to be solved, but as a presence to be protected. In any small mobile hunter-gatherer group, an infant represented something of extraordinary value, not in a sentimental sense, though that too, but in a purely demographic sense. Human infant mortality in the pre-modern world was high. Not every child born survived to reproductive age. Every child who did survive represented a genuine contribution to the group's future, to its labor capacity, its social network, its genetic continuity. This means that the group's investment in keeping an infant alive was not merely altruistic. It was strategic in the deepest sense. The aunts and grandmothers and older siblings who helped with a crying infant were not being generous. They were investing in the future of people they were genetically related to. They were maintaining the group's most valuable resource. And the infant crying was, in this sense, a genuine emergency signal. Not because individual cries were life-threatening, but because the cumulative effect of unmet infant needs, hunger, cold, pain, illness, was potentially fatal. The adult response to infant crying evolved to be urgent because the stakes of not responding were genuinely high. What modern life has done is create a context in which the stakes feel equally urgent. The cry activates the same neural response, but the social infrastructure for responding is dramatically reduced. One parent, alone, in an isolated bedroom, at 2 a.m, with no grandmother down the hall and no aunt across the fire. The biology of the response is calibrated for a world where the response was shared. The modern experience of it is calibrated for a world where it often isn't. This doesn't make modern parenting wrong. It makes it harder than it needs to be. And it suggests that the drive to seek help, to call someone, to let the grandmother take the baby for an hour, that drive is not a failure of self-sufficiency. It is the accurate recognition that human infants were designed to be raised by more than 2 people, and that when the baby won't stop crying, the answer has always been more people.